Hi there. Welcome back to Black Women North of 50. I'm Wynn Helms, your host, and I'm fortunate to have Dr. Rhonda Williams here today. She is a psychiatrist, and I wanted to talk to her a little bit about all of the things that happen to us when we get to be older, but a lot about depression and what we don't know about it. So, Rhonda, please introduce yourself so that I don't do it wrong.
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with Wynn on her podcast. As she mentioned, I am a psychiatrist and I'm a adult psychiatrist, a board certified adult psychiatrist with a interest in women's health. And to expand on that a little bit more, all my focus is on all the disorders that affect women. So mood disorders like depression, anxiety, trauma like PTSD, perinatal, postpartum disorders. And my approach with my patients is much more of a collaborative approach. I do like to get input from my patients in terms of their expectations of treatment, what they feel is happening, with them that led them to come in and seek my treatment. And I also have an approach that is more of a mind, body, spirit approach. I do not believe that, for example, someone with depression impacts just a small segment of their lives. When you're dealing with something like depression, it encompasses all areas, right? It can affect you physically, it can affect you spiritually, it can affect your relationships. And so in my treatment approach, we try to touch on all of those areas and come up with a treatment plan where we can see substantial change in those areas going forward.
Yes. You know, it, um, maybe we talked about this before, right? Just mind, body, spirit is the way I approach things as well. And you can't just do just one of those
Right.
three areas because it's all connected. And I was listening to the things that you talk about in your practice, and a lot of them are connected: depression, anxiety, all those things. I wanted you to give a definition for depression so that we know what it is.
So I would describe depression as a severe sadness that rises to the level where it affects your functioning, right? And I think we need to distinguish between depression and sadness, right? So sadness is a normal emotion we all go through, right? Some days we wake up, we're just not feeling ourselves, we're sad, but we can still get up, go to work, take care of our families. That's a normal emotion. Sadness, unfortunately, can rise to the level where it impacts your ability to function. So what does that look like practically? Okay, so you may have difficulty getting out of bed. You may lose interest in things that you once enjoyed. You may not want to connect with family or friends. Your sleep may change, appetite may change, energy levels may change. And in very extreme cases, you may start to think about, I don't want to be here. Maybe I, want to check out. Suicidal thoughts may come into play, right? So that's a general overview of what depression looks like. And once it rises to that level, then it's considered a clinical disorder.
I'm so glad you said the thing about sadness, because a lot of times people think it's gotten to be a word that is used a lot
Right.
when really you're just sad and that's normal.
Exactly.
Thank you for making that distinction.
Correct.
Tell me about for women north of 50, some of the things that you're describing happen because you're north of 50. How do you distinguish between what's actually happening physically with the person and this is just normal? You're doing this because you're maturing. And no, we need to look into this because it's deeper than just physiology.
One of the things I would say is depression is never normal. I think sometimes we can live with depression and normalize it, right? But, based on the criteria that I described, if you are living with those symptoms, that is not normal. And that is something that is treatable and something that you need to look into. One of the things I would say, particularly for women north of 50, is, that's a phase of life where we're looking at either perimenopause or we're looking at menopausal symptoms. And so you think of those changes, and those are changes that can impact so many aspects of life, including emotions, right? And so what I tend to see in my practice is as women transition into perimenopause or menopause, they may start to talk about, like, I'm just feeling more sad, my energy levels have plummeted, things I used to enjoy, I'm not enjoying anymore. So certainly you can start to have some of those depressive symptoms present at that phase of life. And one of the things I just want to go back a little bit and say, particularly for women, especially when we transition into certain phases of life, we're a much higher risk of depression. So transition into puberty, transition into motherhood, and then later in life, transition into menopause. So those hormonal shifts in our life certainly put us at higher risk for development of depressive symptoms. So if, for example, you're a woman who's north of 50 and you're starting to notice those symptoms, don't ignore it and say, oh, that's a normal part of aging. That is something that you do need to look at very closely, right? And sometimes that can happen because sleep changes, like we mentioned, the physical changes that go along with menopause. And I think it's also a time in a lot of women's lives where we start to assess where we are in life in terms of career, in terms of relationships. Maybe kids are starting to leave home. So we're going through certain changes that can certainly bring on sadness. And those are all areas that need to be addressed. And I know later on in the podcast, we're going to, certainly get into treatment and how to assess that. But do not ignore those symptoms. That is something that needs to get addressed closely.
Finding is happening with the Black community in terms of seeking help for depression. Is it getting better?
I think it's getting better. I would certainly say during the pandemic, certainly within my practice, I had a lot more Black women seek help, which is a change, right? It was very, very different than before. Um, and I certainly applaud that, right? Because within the Black community, we still need to have a lot more conversations about mental health, the stigma of mental health, seeking treatment. But I certainly think it's getting better. And I think it's certainly getting better, especially with the younger generation, with younger women. Um, I think they're much more likely to want to come in and have a conversation and talk
Yes.
about symptoms, right? I think for women north of 50, which is, the demographic that you're targeting, I think there still needs to be a lot more improvement in that area. And I think we also need to talk about why women in that specific age group do not seek treatment, right? I think some of the things to look at is, certainly the stigma of mental health, um, privacy issues. Do I want to go in and talk to a stranger? And I think we're a community that values those two areas, and we're much more likely to talk to people we're closer to, right? Maybe family members or friends, which is fine, all right? But keep in mind that there can be a lid in terms of how much your family and friends can help you, right? And sometimes they can only take you so far. And then you do have to consider seeking help with a professional, right?
Right. But they love you. They want
They
you
love
to be
you.
better.
Exactly. Exactly. All right.
They
I
may
think
not know
also,
how to get you there. Anyway.
exactly. They can only take you so far. Right. I think one of the other areas to look at too is just access to mental health, right? Whether, someone has insurance or even if you have insurance, your ability to find a therapist, or a psychiatrist you connect to, right? Um, yeah, so those are just some of the areas I think that, hinder people's ability to either want to seek help or even if they're interested, their ability to find the right professional.
I'm going to shift for a second and ask you how you got into psychiatry instead of some other type of medicine.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So when I was in medical school, I actually thought I would be an internist. That was the pathway I was going to take. And I went through my psychiatry rotation, and what I loved about psychiatry is that you get to know a person very intimately. You get to know all parts of who they are, right? And it's a little bit of a puzzle, right? For example, we're talking about depression. So someone could come in with depressive symptoms. So you get a chance to really find out who is this person, their childhood, what led to these depressive symptoms, how you're functioning right now, what are the challenges you're dealing with. So I love that. I love hearing people's stories.
That goes back to mind, body, spirit.
Yes, exactly. It goes back to this whole mind, body, spirit. Who is this person and what led you here? right? And then you're able to develop this really ongoing, evolving relationship with your patients, right? And things happen in their lives, they share it with you, and it's a very rewarding career because you really get to see your patients evolve over time and improve over time and see the transitions they go through and the life changes they go through. So, as a
Yeah.
as a career, it really fit me, and I absolutely made the right choice.
Oh, that's so cool.
Yeah,
I was thinking about my mom, who I'm sure had clinical depression. And in the 70s, who knew from clinical depression? There was no way for her to get help because people weren't looking at it, I don't think, particularly for Black women. It was,
right.
you know, when did that start to change?
Of women seeking help.
Yes, and the medical profession recognizing that it is an issue.
I would say, I mean, I completed training in like the mid 2000s. And I would say around that time, psychiatry and mental health, they were still, it still was not where it was today. Right. And I think I really do think social media had a big part to do with educating the public or just informing the public about mental health. Right. Because you get what I think one of the most powerful things when you're talking about mental health is hearing somebody's story and being able to connect to their story, right? So somebody, saying, okay, this is what I went through with depression and I decided to, go and see a therapist and it's been life changing for me and it's, made such a huge difference. I think that is much more powerful, right? Um, First of all, to increase interest because I mean, psychiatrists and therapists have been around. Um, but I think also as a field, we need to do a better job of just educating people about mental illness or mental well-being. What does it look like to be mentally well? So that if you do not fall into that criteria and you're having those challenges, that people are aware, oh, wait, maybe I do need to speak to somebody. And I would say the third part of it is just making it comfortable to go in and see a professional. I've had patients come in and they're like, I don't know how this works. What do I do? Do I tell you my
Right.
story and what happens? And I'm like, no, I will guide you through that process. Right. So, I love the fact that you're doing your podcast. And I love the fact that we're having this discussion today because we're certainly adding to the educational part of it.
Yes,
Because there's
and
somebody who's going to listen to your podcast who's going to say, oh, I didn't know that about depression.
right, and that's kind of my point. I want this to be educational. I'm gonna throw in some funny somewhere, we'll get there, but, depression is so serious that I really wanted this to be an educational episode, which you're, really helping with. Thank you so much for that. You were talking about the younger generation and depression, and I keep thinking they're gonna be more well-informed, like you're saying, because of the internet, and perhaps they'll be more prepared when they get to be north 50, and unlike
Absolutely. Yeah, I,
yeah.
I, I certainly agree with that. One of the things I would say is, with the recent pandemic, younger people were impacted much more negatively because of the pandemic when it comes to mental health. The rates of anxiety increase, the rates of depression increase, the rates of suicidal ideation increase. And if you really think about it, right, you're younger. I mean, a big part of your experience is your friends, right? Your group, and people were isolated. You couldn't connect the way that you had prior to that, and so I think because younger people were impacted, I feel like they were at the forefront of seeking out treatment, right? I mean, younger people they get their information from social media, right? From TikTok. I've had patients come in like, oh, like I saw this on TikTok and I wanted to come in and, find out more about it. And so starting at a younger age where you really, um, making an effort to improve your emotional well-being, that's a practice that I do feel will continue as a younger group gets older and older.
I've actually had
Um,
people come and say, "Yes, I want my mother to come in."
Absolutely. Yeah. Or they refer family members. I mean, that's happened to us.
Yes,
Right?
yes, exactly. And I find, I don't know if this is your experience, that Black women, and maybe it's just in Los Angeles, and maybe it's just my neighborhood, are very separated. We're not, there's not a natural place to gather unless you're part of a house of worship or something. But the pandemic kind of blew that out of the water too. Uh, what is it that you're finding about Black women in terms of assessment of depression? You mentioned some of this before. I keep thinking about how people think they're just crazy, so they don't go in and get help because they've been in bed for 3 days and aren't functioning and that sort of thing. Do you come in with stories like that, for particularly for older women? Do you have people talking about those things and they're concerned about it, or they just think, I don't know, I'm just not feeling well?
Yeah, I think they're not feeling well. And I think there are also consequences that, may occur that drive people into treatment. So it could be either it's impacting your relationships or your ability to, like, basic things like clean your house, be able to go and buy groceries, or maybe it's affecting your job performance and your boss said something, right? I
Daily
think
activities.
yeah, like daily activities, like it's just not up to par. And, I mean, certainly people will try things to feel better. Maybe they do exercise or they talk to a friend. And if it's not improving with the changes that they've made, that's when they come in and seek help from me. Right. That's what I tend to notice, um, in my practice. And one of the things I forgot to mention earlier, particularly with depression, is that the DSM has mentioned that these symptoms need to be present for at least 2 weeks.
Tell me about the DSM.
Right. So the DSM, you can kind of think of it as like the Bible for mental health disorders. So it's this book where, it defines all of the mental health disorders that are that people experience. So for each disorder, it will describe the symptoms and the duration those symptoms have to be present for. And so every psychiatrist, therapist will refer to the DSM in order to come up with the appropriate diagnosis based on the symptoms that patients present. So we constantly refer to the DSM to come up with your diagnosis. Um, and so, what based on what we had mentioned earlier in terms of the symptoms of depression, right? All the symptoms I mentioned, just to recap that. So, feeling depressed or sadness, losing interest in doing things. Sometimes you may sleep too much or sleep too little, eat too much, eat too little, feeling more fatigued, having difficulty focusing or concentrating, being more forgetful, suicidal thoughts. So, that and you don't have to experience all of those symptoms. So if you experience like at least 5 of those symptoms and those symptoms have been present for at least 2 weeks, that's what we call major depressive disorder. Okay.
You're talking about this, and I'm thinking about the Girl Scout cookies that I bought the other day. Uh, and when I start to feel sad, for me, it's going toward ice cream and something sweet. Not that I'm depressed. That's just where I go for comfort. It's like a comfort thing. But if you're doing more of that than usual, it can be
More
more.
of it than usual. Yeah, right. Exactly. And it's a shift from how you functioned before. Then that's something that needs to get looked at. Yes.
What about the stigma of antidepressants? Is that getting better?
Uh, that's an interesting question. I would say it's probably a little bit of both. All right. Um, I think for people, the idea of having to treat mental health disorders in general, a lot of people still struggle with that. And I think that part of that comes out of this idea that if I have a mental health disorder, I should be able to fix it on my own.
Mm.
And people can equate that with a sign of weakness, that something is wrong with me. And so there are a lot of emotional attachments that I think get projected onto that discussion of antidepressants. And I would say, like with my patients, that specific treatment areas where I spend a lot of time with patients. I want to know, what have you heard about antidepressants? What are your, you know, what are your thoughts about having to start a medication? Is it something you're open to? Do you want to take time? Do you want to start with a therapist first and then come back? And then we can have that discussion. So, in my approach, a lot of it is education around antidepressants because there's a lot of stuff on the internet that is negative
And not correct.
not correct, right? And so part of my job is to really educate you, clarify a lot of those incorrect statements and inaccuracies around antidepressants. And what I would say with antidepressants, first, depending on the severity of your depression, you can have mild, moderate, or severe depression. Depending on the severity, for some people, antidepressants are life changing, and it can really have a positive impact on improving your symptoms and improving your functioning. So it's a treatment option I never take off the table. And depending on where you are and the severity of your symptoms, that is an option I, always bring up with patients. And I would be very transparent with you. I always tell patients, I'm not going to recommend something to you that's going to be harmful. That's my job to do, right?
And I was just thinking, we're living in a time where we have things that are safe, like antidepressants, that can help.
Right? And antidepressants have been around now, 30 plus years. There's tons of research in antidepressants. And so we know so much about them. And these are not drugs that are going to harm you in a negative way. Once you start an antidepressant, you may not need to take it for the rest of your life. It could just be a transitional period as you work with your therapist. So there are multiple options. It's not a one size fits all approach, right? Every patient is unique. Every patient is different. And your treatment plan may look completely different from somebody else who has depression.
What I find is people want to, well, I take it every other day.
Mm-mm.
Yeah. Does
No.
your doctor know this?
Yeah, exactly. And certainly you as a therapist, they're going to tell you that, like, oh, I don't really take it every day or take it as needed. So just to educate your audience, antidepressants are meds that you have to take every single day. You have to be consistent. You got to be committed to the process. And there's certainly a delay in terms of response. So if you start an antidepressant today, you're not going to feel better tomorrow, right? On average, it takes about 4 to 6 weeks for these medications to start to work, and then we may need to adjust their dosages. So usually what I tell patients is when you start an antidepressant, we're looking at appropriately, right? Realistically, we're looking at about a 3-month window before we can really see the full effectiveness of these medications.
That's a tough 3 months.
It's a tough 3 months, but you got to be patient in the process.
Well, also, would you recommend therapy with antidepressants?
Absolutely. Always recommend therapy with antidepressants. And there's research to back that up, right? Where your chance of success and improvement improves when you combine an antidepressant with psychotherapy.
Yeah, I think people think you can go to your PCP, get on Zoloft, and you're going to be fine. And maybe they will. I don't want to, clearly not a doctor. I don't know this. It's just that my experience and information from doctors is that antidepressant with therapy.
Because you also have to look at, well, what occurred that caused you to have a major depressive episode? This is not something that happened in a vacuum. What were the circumstances that led up to that? Those are areas that still need to get addressed with a therapist. And part of the reason for doing that is so that you fully understand what led to this episode. You develop coping skills. You change your perspective on what happened so that if you go through an experience like that again, you are now fully equipped. You feel like you have a better approach, better coping skills to be able to handle that. Like, for example, say that, you're having difficulty with your boss, and that, the stress of going to your job or feeling critiqued or you had a bad review has led to a major depressive episode. Well, with your therapist, you're going to go in and look at, well, what were the circumstances? How did I approach it? What was my thought process about it? How did I take care of myself during that stressful period? So that if I go through an experience like that again, I now feel like I have a better toolkit to be able to handle that. So I would say my approach to mental health is not just about addressing the acute issue. It's about, okay, going forward, how does this look differently? How do you react differently? How do you think about this experience differently? How do you take care of yourself mentally, physically, spiritually going forward?
That's where I wanted to go. When you come into contact to women, and I'm gonna, yeah, women north of 40 or 50, um, that they've had a lifetime of spirituality. They're, maybe set in their what they believe in. Period. What's your experience with women who are set in their spiritual ways and don't find antidepressants to be a way that they want to go for spiritual reasons?
I mean, like I mentioned earlier, so I will talk to them about. I get into specifics about it. Well, what are your specific beliefs that tell you should not be in an antidepressant? What does that look like? You know, is this something you prayed about or talked to your pastor or rabbi about? Um, because it's not just about accepting like, oh, I don't want to take an antidepressant. What are your thought process about that? And I think it also gets into people's expectation of healing spiritually. I think sometimes people can be very specific about what they want their healing process to look like. Sometimes for them, it's like, oh, well, if I just pray, God will take this away. But sometimes, and what I say is, healing is an active process. Sometimes you can pray, but you also have to have a plan, right? Like, what are you doing in order to improve that? Your healing process could be talking to a therapist or getting on a medication, you know, exercise, getting better sleep. So in those conversations, certainly, I respect where you're coming from, but I'm also going to push you a little bit to expand what that looks like in terms of spiritual healing.
Yes, and what I say to people is pray for guidance, because the guidance might lead you to a psychiatrist or a
Okay.
therapist or both.
I think that's a great point. Or certainly pray for guidance, and be open to all areas of what healing
Yes.
looks like. All treatment options, be open, have an open mind about it. Don't have a closed mind about it.
Exactly. What about people who don't have support? They're kind of winging it, and they've got all these outside forces saying, you're crazy, la, 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 la. Do you run into people like that?
Yeah, I certainly run into people like that. And what I focus on is expanding your support system. Is that a support group? Are you part of an organization? Even volunteering, you have to get out and get around people. All right. I think the tendency with depression is to isolate and
Yes.
withdraw, which makes your depression worse. It may feel comfortable, but in the long run, it actually works against you. So, going back to what we mentioned about mind, body, spirit approach, well, what's happening with your relationships? Who are you talking to? When is the last time you went out and saw somebody? Just connecting to people online is not going to be enough. You need to have face-to-face conversations with people. If something were to happen to you, who's the person you're going to reach out to and call, right? I think for me, one of the most heartbreaking things is when patients say, well, you're my only support. Mm-mm, that's not enough, right? We got to build and expand on that support system, right? We're human beings that need connection. We need to have social connection. And so, with my patients, that's an area I always follow up, like what's happening socially, what's happening with your relationships, because that's also part of your healing process. You could be
Right.
feeling better, but if you don't have people around you, again, there's going to be a lid in terms of your healing.
I'm thinking about a couple of things as you're talking. One is during the pandemic,
Yes.
holy goodness, that your lines, the telephone lines must have been, blowing up because of needing support, wanting support, and not being able to go out and see people. And
Yes. Yes.
do you
Exactly.
find that there are residual effects from the pandemic?
Yes, I think there are residual effects in that. I think some people forgot how to socialize. What does that look like? Right. What do I do?
Where do I go?
Where do I go? And who do I call? And who
I'm
do I
not going to
hang
go
out with?
alone.
Exactly. Yes, I want to do it alone. And so the word I would say when it comes to that is intentionality. You have to be intentional about improving that area of your life. And I tell patients, I'm like, set up plans with people. You need to have something to look forward to. Okay, well, I'm going to have dinner with this friend, or I'm going to meet with a colleague and have coffee. You need your calendar needs to have things for you to look forward to. And I think especially, um, with women north of 50, which is a demographic you're focusing on, relationships change as we get older, right? I think we have to fully accept that. And a lot of times patients will say, well, where do I go? Like, how do I meet friends? I don't know, how do I change that? And that could be different for different people. I mean, certainly, are you part of a church? Are you part of an organization? Are you around like-minded people? And I would say also being patient about improving your social life. This is not something that the first time you go out and meet with somebody, you're going to make a connection. Sometimes you don't.
Yeah.
But
The numbers
still
game.
stay consistent with
Mhm.
it. You're going to find people who are similar to you and have similar beliefs and similar interests, but stay with the process.
And that's so difficult over 50. I'm like, okay, yeah, I'm tired. I'm not, I want to be intentional. I just don't have it.
Right.
And it's not good. As you said, it's something that has to be intentional. It has to be something that you
It
do.
has to be
I,
intentional. Like you mentioned, right? It's difficult. It's not impossible.
no, not at all. Not at all. And
Not at all.
it's not
Not
like
at
you have
all.
to go out every day of the week. Just,
Right. Right.
every
And it
once in a
looks
while.
different. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, it looks different than when you're young. When we're younger, you're in school, you're working, you're meeting so many people. You don't have to think about it.
Right.
That changes as you get older. Now you got to put a lot more effort into it. And the effort is good effort because you're going to get so much out of those connections and those relationships. That's absolutely worth it.
It's kind of like the antidepressant. It takes a minute for it to work.
A minute, but then it starts to work. Yeah,
It starts to work and then get better after that. Absolutely. Absolutely. Like I was saying before, I think my mom was clinically depressed most of my life. And looking back, I see the things that we didn't do and the things that were hard for me to do with her.
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, oh my goodness, that's because she was depressed and she didn't have it. She didn't have it to give. I mean, she's a mom, she's a professional, she's a wife, all these things
Mm-hmm.
that we kind of can take for granted. It's like, oh, I'm not busy. I've got all, no, you got a lot going on.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder about what I didn't get
Mm-hmm.
having a depressed mother.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
What do you tell to parents with depression about how to relate to their children?
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, I mean, I think you bring up a very important point. That we talk about like the tentacles of depression, how it covers multiple areas, and you're functioning. When you have depression, you're limited in terms of how much you can be there for somebody. All right. I mean, you're just exhausted. You're not thinking clearly. You're overwhelmed. You're fatigued. You're not sleeping well. And so, certainly as a parent, that is going to impact your ability to connect to your kids and how you relate to them or even how you take care of them. And so, if you're thinking multi generationally, that, if you were raised with a mom with depression, that's going to impact you. And it's going to impact how you felt she parented. Maybe on an emotional level, she was not able to connect to you or give you what you needed emotionally because she couldn't give that to herself. Right.
And she
And
probably
so
didn't get it from her mother.
she didn't get it from her mother. And so we tend to repeat the things we were raised with. That's just naturally what humans do. It's different when we become aware that, wait a second, this may be an issue.
Right.
I'm going to be intentional about changing this or getting professional help. All right. So I certainly have patients who were raised with, parents who were depressed and that impacted how they felt. And the other thing I think we have not addressed is that there certainly can be a genetic component to this. We can certainly run in families. I think the other component that we have not addressed that we need to look at is trauma. There can be multi-generational trauma. And
I think in
then
the Black community, that's very true.
Very true. And we don't talk about it, right? Maybe your grandmother had depression and she was abused and she said nothing, and that happened to your mother, right? And she did not talk about it. And now you're in a situation, maybe that happened to you as well, right? So, what I would say is, especially in the Black community, there's certain topics that become off limit. We don't talk about it, don't mention it, don't talk to anybody about it.
And mental health is one of them.
That's one of them. And there's sickness in silence. It does not work to your benefit to not talk about your experience and talk about what has impacted you.
Oh,
And I don't hold that against anybody, because sometimes we don't even know how to start those conversations.
we don't get taught that being vulnerable is something that is good.
Exactly. How do I have
And
that conversation with somebody? So I would say, like, for a Black woman who's in that situation where maybe you have been in a family like that, you can start that conversation. Just start that conversation in terms of, like, talking about, like, well, what was your experience like? Have that conversation face to face and have it in a place that is private. And this is not going to be a one-time conversation. This is going to be
right.
an ongoing conversation. Like, I just want to know more about you. I want to know, like, how you felt growing up, and how did that impact how you thought of yourself and how you thought about going forward and your confidence. Open up and have conversations.
And I got to say, yes, that would be a wonderful thing. I grew up with a mother who was very closed, and trying to get out of her what her experience was very, very difficult.
Mhm.
I think we're getting better at that.
I think we're getting better at that. Yes, yes,
I
yes.
hope so.
I
Because
hope so. Yes. I hope so. And I think it's, like you mentioned before, it's definitely multi-generational. I think, older generation, those were not topics anybody had. Nobody understood mental health. Like, mental health, what? You just get up and keep going. What are you talking about? Right?
exactly, I got to go to work. I'm going.
Keep going. And and I would describe it as, it's really a luxury to be able to talk about your mental health.
It just is.
It is. It's a
And
luxury to say, like, oh, let me actually consider how this has impacted me emotionally and mentally. Right. And the reason why I describe it as a luxury is because other people never had that ability to take the
goodness.
time to do that, or had the resources to be able to do that, or
Or the
access to
permission, just
information.
societal
Yes.
permission to,
Permission to be able to do that. Absolutely. Absolutely.
it's we're evolving in this
Yes.
area.
Yes, we
Yeah.
are. Yes.
Dr. Williams, any closing thoughts about depression with Black women north of 50?
Mhm.
That I recognize that depression is global. I mean, a lot of people get depression. I understand that. I can't help thinking that in the Black community, there are layers of life that add to depression, particularly in Black women over 50. And I wondered if there are things that you would say to that population in your work with depression.
Yeah. What I would say is that if you're someone who is experiencing depression, what I would say is seek help. Do not go through that process by yourself. You do not need to go through that process by yourself. There's so much research, so many resources available. And this is something that you can certainly heal from and improve from. And say you're someone who has never had treatment for depression. You're like, where do I start? Okay.
Right.
I would say start with your primary care doctor. Go in, talk to your primary care doctor. You can also ask for resources from, like, a friend or a family member. You go through your insurance panel, look up therapists. If they are Black therapists or Black psychiatrists that you can find. And I would say be patient in the process when you're looking to choose somebody. Maybe the first person you have an appointment with, you may not connect to. That's fine. Continue the journey.
It's like shopping.
Yeah, it's like shopping for shoes, right? You don't like the first pair, you go find another pair. Same thing with, like, a therapist. Keep looking until you find the right
The
fit.
fit.
Exactly. Exactly. And I would say, do not ignore your mental health, right? Just like people get up and go to the gym and work out, what are you doing in terms of improving your mental emotional health. And it's your mental and emotional health is definitely tied into your physical health. How you take care of yourself physically will impact how you feel emotionally. And the other thing I would mention is having a toolkit when it comes to emotional health. What do I do on a daily basis? Do I take time to check in with how I feel? Um, do I journal? When things happen to me that are difficult, how what is my process for spending time to work through those emotions? We talk about, we mentioned earlier about like your social network. Are there people in your life that you can go and talk to? Um, Getting good quality sleep. There's a conversation I have with patients all the time. You have to be, and especially for women north of 50, getting
I
good
gotta,
sleep is also going to impact your emotional health.
I gotta say, I love a good nap.
Yes.
Let's put it out there.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's helpful,
It's helpful. It's
and
absolutely helpful
more helpful now that I'm north of 50 than before.
than before. Absolutely.
Like, what do you do to
Mhm.
treat yourself? Well, I take a nap. That's
Take a nap.
part of my
Yeah.
part of
I
my
take a nap.
self-care.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say like, eating a good healthy diet. And lastly, what I would say is just taking care of your mental health is also part of self-care. It's a requirement. You have to do it. And certainly as we get older, we go through difficulties and struggles and things that will impact our mental health. You cannot ignore it. You ignore it, there are going to be negative repercussions that come from that. Right?
For you and for the people around you.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much. This has been a really informative time. I appreciate it so much.
You're welcome.
Before we go, I'm going to ask Dr. Williams to talk about resources for people who are suffering from depression.
So, a couple of resources I wanted to mention is certainly speaking to your primary care doctor, um, going through your insurance panel. So, insurance panels will have a listing of psychiatrists as well as therapists that you can contact. Um, there's also the American Psychological Association that has listings of therapists as well. There's Psychology Today that has tons of listing of therapists that you can check out. And
Also, blackfemaletherapist.com is
yes,
another one.
okay, Therapy for Black Girls is also a really good resource.
And like you said, going through your insurance panel. Until you come back again, please create some joy. Try and be curious about everything. And please find some funny. We need it bad. Thank you so much for joining me on Black Women North of 50. And I'll see you next time.